Hello everyone, my name is Janny Hou. I'm a full-time developer from the LoopBack team, and today my presentation will be how to secure your APIs using LoopBack authentication system. So some of you may heard of LoopBack before, while some of you may not. So before I talk about the authentication, let me do a quick introduction of what is LoopBack. So LoopBack is a Node.js framework written in TypeScript. It's compatible with the JavaScript project as well. LoopBack is a framework for creating APIs, particularly REST APIs. It allows developers to scaffold and expose their endpoints in a very fast and convenient way. And besides the outstanding REST API experience, LoopBack offers more beyond that. It's a highly extensible framework, which means extension developers can contribute and add extensions to customize the behaviors according to their requirements. And it's also a framework for platform developers to develop their own platform on top of us. So as a summary, LoopBack allows people to create highly extensible and scalable applications, and it's a technique widely used in microservices. So next, let's take a look what authentication means in LoopBack. So first, I will do a brief introduction of the architecture of our module. So as you can see from this diagram, at the very bottom is the core module of LoopBack. It's built with the techniques called context and dependency injection, which makes a LoopBack application like a central registry, and you can inject all your artifacts as the dependencies, which guarantees that people can build high extensible and scalable applications using LoopBack. And on top of the core module, as you can see, here we have our tooling module and all those artifact modules to help you create and expose APIs very fast here. And so this is what this box means. You can create your endpoints in minutes by running some commands. And on the other side, a complicated application needs to talk to different services and data sources at the backend, and we also provide the data source connection and the proxy to help you do that. So this is what it means here. You can communicate with different backend services and databases. So after you launch your LoopBack application and expose a bunch of endpoints to retrieve or manipulate your backend resources, you may want to secure your endpoints by verifying the identity of the request. And this is when the authentication happens. So in a LoopBack application, the authentication happens when you want to secure and protect your API endpoints by understanding who sends the request. Next, let's have a better understanding of what is a LoopBack authentication system and what it does. So LoopBack authentication system understands who sends the request, and it resolves the identity or say principal from the incoming request, and then set it as the current user in the system so that other components in the system knows who is the principal of the request. So LoopBack authentication system is highly extensible and scalable, which means you can plug in multiple authentication strategies and also manage them, and also specify them for your endpoints. We highly recommend to app developers to implement their own authentication strategies to protect their application according to their business requirements. But in case you want to leverage the existing community modules, we still support that. So if you are an Express developer, you may know that it has a very popular module called Passport, which contains which supports like over 500 of authentication middleware. So LoopBack also provides an adapter to convert a Passport middleware into a LoopBack authentication strategy. So next, I will use a typical user scenario to help you understand the mechanism of LoopBack authentication system. So for example, now you want to create a to-do application. It has a model called to-do, and it exposes a bunch of CRUD operations to manipulate the to-do instances, like create, retrieve, delete, and modify the to-do instances. And the system also has a user model and a few APIs allow you to sign up as a user and then log in. So lastly, this application secure the to-do CRUD operations in a way that only authenticated users can perform those CRUD operations. And in this example, we will use a very popular authentication strategy called GWT, brief for JSON Web Token, to secure our endpoints. So the GWT authentication encodes all your user information in a token and then send the token in the header of a request so that the framework receives the request, knows the user information from the token. And so this diagram is this diagram shows how the authentication works for our scenario. A LoopBack application consists of different parts, but you don't need to understand all of them. In our case, there are only two concepts you need to understand. One is called sequence, and one is called controller. So sequence means when a request comes in, the LoopBack app has its default REST server, which executes a sequence of actions to process your request. So as you can see, it has action called find route, and authenticate is also one of its actions. So the next concept is controller. So a controller, like everyone knows the MVC pattern here. So the controller is where you put all the core logic in. So in our case, the request is called get/to-do to retrieve the to-do instance, and the corresponding controller method is called find here. It's defined here. And next, let's see when a request comes in, what happens in your LoopBack application. So let's see. Now you send a request get/to-do with a GWT token encoded in the header. The token contains all the user information. And now the request comes to the application. The application passes the request to the sequence to process it. First, the action is find route. As you can see, there's a connection here from the find route action to the decorator get here. So we use a REST decorator to decorate the find methods. It specifies the path for it. So this is how the find route action finds the corresponding controller method, and then it executes the authenticate action to decode the user information from the token, and then the system knows who's the user, and it sets the user as the current user in the system, so that when the request passes to the controller file, the controller method here can inject the user from the system. And now you can see that it's pretty simple, right? You only need to do a few things. Like you need to mount some authentication components in your application, and then you add the authenticate action in your sequence, and decorate your endpoints with the strategy name, and then all the other things, all the core logic of authentication are handled by the rest of our framework. So next, let's take a look of what we have here in the LoopBack framework to make such authentication mechanism work. So the core module of authentication component is called LoopBack/authentication. So what it does is it glues all the authentication parts together. As you can see, you need a part to provide the authentication metadata here, and you need another part to provide the authenticate action, and you also need a third part which does the core logic of JWT strategy. So this component makes sure each part can communicate and understand each other. And next, you need another extension component which does all the core logic of the authentication, of the JWT authentication. For example, how to encode and decode those user informations, and how to manage your user, the user login and user sign up, and all this token and user services. So those are provided by an extension called LoopBack/JWT-authentication. So this module is just a prototype module for people to try as a sample. It's not ready for production. It's not ready for production use, but it's very important. But it's a very important module to help you understand our authentication system. And by learning and using this module, you will know how to create your own authentication strategy extension. So as you can see, it consists of the core JWT strategy, which does the authenticate action, and also some services which manage your user and token. So this module is usually contributed by extension developers. So as a summary, as an app developer, you need to add this code here to enable the authentication and specify the strategy name for your controller methods. And our LoopBack framework provides a core authentication component and to glue everything together, and also a prototype implementation of JWT extension here. So usually this should be contributed by the extension contributors, and as you can see, it contains some services. So next, let me explain what's inside the authentication component. So the component exports mainly 4 parts. The first one is the authenticate decorator. Here is its syntax, and you can apply this decorator to your controller method or the controller class itself. What this decorator does is it specifies the authentication strategy's name and its corresponding options to the particular endpoints. Here is an example, as you can see here. So we have a controller method called whoami, which prints out the current user, and it maps to the endpoint /whoami. And here we use the authenticate decorator to decorate this method, and it specifies the strategy's name is GWT, and this is how the system knows when this function is invoked. It searches for the strategy with name GWT to resolve the user profile from the request. And the next one is the authenticate action. As I mentioned earlier, it's invoked as part of the sequence. And so each strategy, its authentication strategy, has a function called authenticate, which resolves the user profile from the request. And the authentication action invokes that strategy's authenticate function to get the returned user profile and then sets it in the system so that other components knows who's the current user. And the action function is also where you can do the error handling according to different responses. So here is a code snippet of our implementation of the action. As you can see here, it invokes the strategy's authenticate method to get the user profile, and then there's some request and response handling, and calls the set current user function here to set the user profile to the system. So this is our implementation, but you feel free to customize the implementation and provide your own action. And next is a screenshot of how the action is being added in the sequence. As you can see here, it's get injected as the authenticate request function and get called here right after the find route action. You perform the authentication for the request, and then you pass the parameters and do all these calculations with your controller method. The third one is a strategy interface. So an authentication strategy is where the core logic of verifying a principal's identity happens. So our framework defines the strategy interface so that extension developers can implement that interface and provide their strategies as extensions. So one authentication strategy contains two main members. One is the property name, and the second one is the method authenticate. As I just explained, it does this. So here is an example implementation of the JWT authentication strategy. As you can see here, it has a method called authenticate, which extracts the credentials from a request and then verify the token to decode the user profile and return it as the result. And here you can see this is how you specify, you give the strategy a name. The last one is the strategy extension. A strategy extension is like a registry that you can register different authentication strategies to it. It's implemented using this design pattern called extension point/extensions. So an extension point represents a common functionality that your framework depends on and interact with, and extensions are the real implementations of that specific logic for the extension point. So in our case, all the authentication strategies are the extensions, and you can register them to the strategy extension point. So when a request comes in and the authentication action is invoked, the strategy extension has a way to retrieve the metadata from the system. This is how it knows the strategy's name and options. Then it searches among the registered strategies by the name and find the correct strategy and then return it to the authenticate action. So the extension pattern here makes sure your app is extensible and scalable. So this is an example of how to register a strategy in your app. As you can see here, there's a function called register authentication strategy, which is exported from the component to help you register a strategy to the application. So next is the hands-on tutorial part. I will show you a demo of how to secure your application using the JWT authentication. So here is the overview of our scenario. The client logs in with credentials, and if the username and password are correct, the system will generate a JWT token which encodes the user information in it and return it to client. Next, client use that token the client include the token in the header to perform some operations to the protected endpoints. And the server receives the request header and verifies the token. If the token is valid and author is authenticated, you will have access to those protected endpoints, and server will send you the response. Otherwise, you will be rejected with the 401 error. So this demo will use an extension called LoopBack/authentication JWT, which contains all the core logic of JWT authentication strategy and also corresponding token user services in it. And we will be using an existing application, a to-do application, as the base one, and apply our strategy to its exposed endpoints. So let's start by cloning the to-do example. Make sure you install the LoopBack CLI before you follow this tutorial. So the model name is called @loopback/CLI. Make sure you install the command globally on your local. Since I already have it installed, I will skip this step. And then you can run rb4 example space to do to clone the to do example. So to save the time, I will also skip this step. It will also install the app for you. And next, since we already have the app installed locally, let's go to the folder called LoopBack for example to do. So first, we need to install the two components we just mentioned. npm i-save. The first one is called LoopBack authentication, and the next is called LoopBack/authentication JWT. So these are the two names of the module. And after we clone the repository and install the model, let's take a quick look of the file structure of the app. So as you can see, this app contains a to-do model here and is corresponding to the controller. So if you open the controller file, see it contains a bunch of CRUD operations like create to-do and find to-do by ID, all these CRUD operations. And our target in this demo is to secure these endpoints by the JWT strategy. So let's first mount the two components in application file. So open the application.ts file here, and you will find in the application constructor, there is a line to mount the components, and we can just add ours after it. Call this .component. The first module is called authentication component. let's import it here. Authentication component from, so VS Code automatically detects the name here. And let's add the next one, this component theme, and GWT authentication component. So let's also copy the component name here and import it. So VS Code should be able to automatically import them, but somehow it doesn't work here. So that's why we need to manually add them. And next, let's do one more step to bind a data source to the app. So let me quickly explain what is data source. So LoopBack 4 uses 3 artifacts to provide the data persistency. Model describes the local data's shape only, and data source configures the remote connection to the database, and repository encapsulates a model and data source to provide the persistence behavior. And the reason why we need to bind a data source here is because the GWT extension contains a user service which also contains a default user model and its corresponding repository, but it doesn't provide the persistency for the model. So that's why we need to bind our existing data source here to the app to make that user model persistent. So the DB name is called DB data source, and the binding is called user service bindings dot data source underscore name. Here we go. Let's auto import it. And also import this one. Cool. Now we mounted these 2 components in our application file. And the second step is to add the authenticate action in the sequence file. So let's inject it. Let's name it as authenticate ops. Request. Let's import it. And then between the find route and pass parameters, let's invoke the authenticate request action. Should be lowercase. So let's do one more thing in the error handling here. So if a invalid user comes in, we want to reject the request. So that's why we need to check the error passed from the authentication module, and if it's user not found or strategy not found, we want to return 401 for the request. So to save the time, I will copy this code from the existing file here. It's in the sequence at the end of the sequence file. Let's copy this and replace the existing line. So need to edit the code a little bit, and let's import them from the authentication module. So now we've finished adding the action to the sequence. And the third step, let's create a user controller so that you can log in and sign up. So to save the time, I will also copy-paste the existing file from here. Since GitHub has a better preview, I'm opening the file from here. As you can see, this JWT extension contains a default user and user repository. And here is the user controller class, and the first endpoint is called login, as you can see here. So what it does is it verifies the credentials by calling a function from the user service and then convert the user into a standard user profile that the authentication system understands, and then it invokes a function from the JWT service to generate the token that encodes all the user information in it and return the token to the client. And the second function is a very typical protected endpoint. It's protected by the JWT strategy here, as you can, if you still remember, I mentioned authenticate decorator. So after the request comes in, the system decodes the user from header and then set it in the system, and that's why you can inject the user profile here, and this function just returns the current user's ID. And the last function is sign up. You can create new user instance using it. So let me first copy this file, and let's create a controller by running commands lb4 space controller. Give controller a name, should be user. And since we provide the content, let's choose the empty controller here. See, there's a file called user.controller.ts created in this file, and it just has an empty class. Let's replace it by our implementation. So now we have all the user endpoints created, and the last step is to protect your to-do endpoints. See if you still remember what I mentioned. We can use the same decorator to decorate the entire controller. Same name, JWT, and let's import it from the extension. From the component. So let's try run the app. It takes some time to build to compile the app, and now it runs. Let's go to the Explorer in the browser. So So the Explorer is just something LoopBack offers for people to try the endpoints they exposed in the controllers. As you can see, the user controller and this endpoint are organized under the to-do controller. Let's first try this endpoint without logging in. See, you get rejected by the 401 error because you haven't logged in. And let's try the to-do controller's endpoint. We don't need this complicated filter. Let's delete it and execute. Same here, right? 401. And then let's try to sign up and log in and see if there is any difference. Let's provide an email. Let's call it loopback@gmail.com. And password. loopback12345. You can copy this object because you need the same credential to sign in later. And see, the new user is created here. And then let's log in with the same credential. See, there's a token returned to the client. Let's copy the token. This token includes all the user information in it. So there's a authorize button here at the very top of the Explorer. Just click this button and copy paste your token here. This is something provided by the Swagger engine that allows you to provide the token in header, and then the following requests will all include this token in their headers. And click authorize, and then close the window. Let's try this endpoint again. Execute. See, this time it's not 401 anymore. You see the logged in user's ID here. And let's try the to-do endpoint again. See, now you can retrieve all the to-do instances like this. So this is how you use the JWT strategy to protect your endpoints by only authenticated users can visit them. So now we've finished the JWT authentication demo. You know how to secure your APIs using JWT strategy, and you also understand all the concepts in our authentication module. So next I will cover some more advanced use cases. For example, in a real-world application, usually it has more than one authentication strategy. And we have an example here called passport login, which demos how to provide multiple authentication strategies. You can find its code here. So as you can see, this example has more than one strategies here, like those auth2 strategies and the basic and the local strategy. So this is what the app looks like when it runs. So as you can see here, you can log in, use your local credentials, or you can log in with the third-party accounts. And let's back to the slides. And we also have many awesome examples from our community as the implementation reference. So they can be found here. And the second link is for the passport login application. You can play with this application to try all those different scenarios. And next, I would like to cover two more advanced topics. So the first one is you may already notice that in the previous demo, we use an existing strategy. But if you are an extension developer and you want to create and register your own strategy, you can follow this tutorial to learn how to do it step by step. And the second one is, as I mentioned earlier, we are compatible with over 500 express passport strategies. So this tutorial here shows you how to convert a password middleware using our adapter into a loopback flavor strategy. And at the end of the tech talk, I would also like to introduce the authorization system in LoopBack, which is the next step of authentication. So authentication resolves the user identity from the request. It knows who sends the request, but authorization determines whether that user has access to a certain resource. So the authorization, that's the access control. To learn more about the authorization module, you can find its documentation here. So this is the end of the tech talk, and thank you for listening to this presentation. And as a summary, this is our authentication documentation, and this is the GWT example I just showed in the demo. Hope everyone learns what they are interested to know, and just click these links to try the loopback authentication.